When Ivy Lynn sent me the photograph, I was standing in the lighting booth above the old Belmont Theater, watching technicians test the gold wash that would flood the stage at 8 of the clock sharp. In the picture, she wore a white ski jacket unzipped just enough to reveal the diamond chain I had chosen 2 years ago for my wedding anniversary. Adrian Vale stood behind her on a chalet balcony in St. Moritz, his chin resting on her shoulder, his gloved hand spread possessively over her waist. Snow drifted past them in soft silver flakes. Their smiles were bright, lazy, intimate. Beneath the image, Ivy wrote only one line.
Mrs.
Vale, he said. The mountains are prettier when no one is waiting for him at home. I looked at the screen for 3 seconds, locked my phone, and told the lighting engineer to dim the left bank by 15%. The gold was too warm. The audience tonight would need a colder light. The Belmont Theater belonged to Rowan Heritage, the cultural arm of the Rowan Group, and Rowan Group belonged in every way that mattered to me. Not to Adrian, though society columns liked to call him the face of the empire. Not to the board members who toasted him. Not to the finance magazines that ran flattering profiles about the poor scholarship boy who had married into power and then reinvented an old family conglomerate into a modern luxury machine. My grandfather had built the first hotels. My mother had expanded into restoration and private clubs. I had been negotiating land acquisitions before Adrian had even learned which fork to use at a donor dinner. I let him shine because at 28, I had confused partnership with devotion and competence with love. That confusion had lasted 7 years, which was long enough to teach me how expensive sentiment could become if you fed it with your own silence. I had known about Ivy for months. Not because Adrian confessed, and not because guilt ever touched his handsome, disciplined face. I knew because women like Ivy never truly wanted secrecy. They wanted hierarchy. They wanted the thrill of being chosen over another woman and the visible proof that they were climbing. First, it was the perfume on his scarf. Powdery and sweet, the kind no man carries home by accident twice. Then it was the extra charge on the corporate card for a suite in Kyoto on a trip that required 1 room, not 2. Then the midnight voice note that arrived on Adrian's secondary phone while he showered. Are you still awake? I miss your hands. By the time I found the draft equity memo he had hidden in a folder, labeled vendor updates, a memo proposing a new lifestyle spinoff with Ivy, named as chief of the division in exchange for creative acceleration, the affair itself had stopped mattering. What mattered was that he was careless enough to mix desire with company property and stupid enough to assume I would never notice the difference. I never confronted him in those early weeks. Women are taught that confrontation is dignity, but men like Adrian hear confrontation as a warning shot. They begin deleting, cleaning, denying, rehearsing tears. I preferred records that remained warm from use. So I watched. I let the house stay orderly. I let dinner appear on the table. I let him speak about market strategy while his gaze drifted toward a phone face down beside his plate. I listened when he praised Ivy's instincts in the office and called her refreshingly fearless in the same tone he once used for my judgment. I stored every invoice, every calendar discrepancy, every transfer to shell vendors whose registered addresses led back to cousins and former classmates of Ivy's. I had been raised in a family that survived because it documented everything. Love had not erased that training, it had merely delayed its application. So when she sent the St. Moritz photograph on the morning of our winter gala, she was not delivering information. She was ringing a bell and waiting for me to bleed. The gala that night mattered to Adrian because he intended to use it as a stage. Rowan Heritage was unveiling the North Key project, a mixed development that would anchor the next 5 years of expansion, residences, hotel towers, a members club, a waterfront museum, and a design incubator. Adrian had spent 3 months hinting that he would announce a bold new leadership structure after the chairman's toast. He assumed I did not know that the structure included a spin-off. He and Ivy had already started planning behind my back. He assumed I would hear her name from the podium and be too stunned to speak. He knew me once as a woman who cried in private and solved problems in public. He had not yet met the version of me that could reverse the order. At noon, I left the theater and drove to Chambers & Sue, the law firm my family had used since my grandfather sued a shipping partner in 1989, and won. Marcus Sue met me in the small conference room without surprise. He was a narrow, careful man with the eyes of someone who had built a career out of other people's panic. I placed 3 folders on the table. The first held proof of Adrian's affair. The second held proof that he had diverted company funds, gifts, and travel expenses to Ivy and 2 related party vendors. The third held our post-nuptial agreement, signed 4 years earlier after a minor scandal in Hong Kong had frightened his publicists and soothed my mother. Clause 9 stated that if either spouse engaged in conduct that exposed the other to public humiliation, financial risk, or reputational harm through infidelity, undisclosed gifts, misuse of shared assets, or actions materially damaging a Rowan-controlled entity, the injured spouse could trigger immediate separation of interests and clawback review. Adrian had signed without reading. Men in love with their own luck often mistake paper for ceremony. Marcus turned pages for 20 minutes, said nothing, then removed his glasses. If you want a quiet divorce, he said, we can still do quiet. If you want corporate action, you have enough to remove him as chief executive by midnight if 3 directors stay with you. If you want criminal exposure, procurement fraud and misuse of restricted funds can take us farther, but that route will be messy. I folded my hands and considered the city visible through the window. Cranes, gray river, winter sun like polished metal. I do not want drama, I said. I want architecture. I want every consequence placed exactly where it belongs. Start the internal audit memorandum, freeze discretionary executive spending at 9 tonight. Notify board counsel to attend the gala as if it were routine governance, and prepare removal papers in case Adrian forces the harder route. Marcus gave one short nod. He had known my mother. He understood the difference between rage and design. My next stop was the trust office on Mercer Street, where 2 signatures from me could alter the gravity beneath several men's feet. The public believed Adrian owned more of Rowan Group than he did. In reality, the voting bloc that controlled appointments, project authorizations, and intellectual property sat in the Rowan Family Preservation Trust under my stewardship until my future children reached 30. Adrian held options, performance units, and the title that came with cameras. He did not own North Key. He did not own the heritage trademarks attached to our flagship properties. And most importantly, he did not own the design patents and licensing agreements he had promised Ivy would become the backbone of her glittering new empire. I signed temporary restrictions against transfers involving North Quay, the lifestyle spin-off, and any new officer appointments pending audit review. Then I instructed Trust Security to prepare sealed packets for distribution at the gala, one for Adrian, one for Ivy, one for the board secretary, and one for the interim chief operating officer, who did not yet know he would be promoted before dessert. By 4 o'clock I was home. Adrian arrived an hour later, fresh from the tailor, carrying a velvet box. He crossed the dressing room with the soft confidence of a man who believed the evening belonged to him.
For you, he said, opening the box to reveal emerald drop earrings.
North Quay Green. He smiled in the mirror over my shoulder. We should look like a united front tonight. I met his reflection without blinking.
How thoughtful, I said.
He watched me carefully, maybe expecting frost, maybe hunting for proof that Ivy had already succeeded in clawing under my skin. Men always want visible wounds. They resent being forced to imagine the depth of damage they caused. When I only fastened one earring and asked whether he preferred the ivory gown or the black silk, some small part of his suspicion relaxed. Wear the black, he said. You look formidable in black. It was the first honest sentence he had spoken to me in weeks. Ivy arrived at the theater just after 7 in a column of pearl fabric, with a neckline chosen to appear elegant from a distance and reckless up close. She had never learned the difference between subtlety and restraint. When she saw me near the donor entrance, she faltered for one beat, then recovered with a smile dipped in sugar.
Mrs.
Vale, she said, your husband was just looking for you. Of course he was, I replied. Tonight requires precision. Her eyes darted over my face, perhaps searching for the swollen lids, the trembling mouth, the female collapse she had hoped to provoke that morning. Finding none, she leaned closer. The mountains suited him, she murmured. He looked happier than I have ever seen him. I adjusted her shoulder seam with 2 fingers as if she were a junior staffer dressed incorrectly. Then I smiled. Ambition suits you too, Ivy. Just make sure you can afford the tailoring. She laughed, but her throat worked as she stepped away. The gala opened with strings, champagne, and the kind of old money restraint that makes newer money itch. Donors moved through the gilded foyer under projected renderings of North Quay. Journalists lined the red carpet. Adrian did what he did best, shook hands, recalled names, projected warmth over calculation. Beside him, Ivy floated from guest to guest, introducing artists to developers, developers to council advisors, advisors to trustees, collecting attention with both hands. More than once I caught her touching the ring she wore on her right hand, a slim band of pave diamonds Adrian had bought under a consultant invoice 2 months earlier. Not an engagement ring, but a rehearsal. That was how affairs like theirs worked. They tested ownership and accessories first, in language second, in public space last. Tonight, she believed, would be the night she graduated from secret to structure. At 8:45, the guests took their seats in the main hall. The stage was washed in cold gold, just as I had ordered. Adrian walked out to polite applause and gave a speech polished enough to sound spontaneous. He spoke about heritage, transformation, cities reborn, our duty to create beauty with discipline. He thanked the board, the donors, our architectural partners. He even thanked me, calling me the quiet force behind Rowan Heritage. The room laughed warmly. Ivy, seated 2 tables from the stage beside a museum trustee, old enough to be her grandfather, lowered her eyes like a woman practicing modesty before coronation. Then Adrian said the line I had been waiting for. Before we close, I would like to share one more surprise about the future leadership of North Quay and our new lifestyle division. That was my cue. Not his. Mine. I rose from the chairman's table without hurrying and climbed the side stairs to the stage. The room assumed this was part of the choreography. It helped that my dress was black and the lights were obedient. Adrian turned toward me with a smile that only cracked when I took the second microphone from the stand and did not reach for his hand. Since my husband has mentioned surprises, I said, perhaps we should begin with the one that matters most to governance. The applause faltered. There is no elegant way to describe how a room changes when wealth senses scandal. People do not gasp first. They sharpen. Glasses lower, shoulders still. Every eye becomes an instrument. I looked out over hundreds of faces and felt not fear, but a terrible calm. Effective immediately, all announcements regarding North Quay leadership are suspended pending an internal audit authorized this afternoon by the Rowan Family Preservation Trust and by counsel to the board. Tonight, several documents were served related to undisclosed conflicts of interest, unauthorized financial transfers, and potential breaches of fiduciary duty involving senior management. If Adrian had merely lied to me, I might have saved him publicly for the sake of our name. If he had merely embarrassed me, I might have chosen the private blade. But he had touched company money, trust property, and project authority. He had reached into the machinery and tried to make my family's inheritance feed his appetite. That changed everything. Behind me, the central screen shifted from a rendering of North Quay's waterfront tower to a clean white slide carrying 3 headings: executive entertainment, vendor deviations, and unapproved disbursements. Beneath them appeared dates, amounts, vendor shells, hotel bookings, and gifted items. Not the affair, photographs not yet. I had no need to begin with sex, when greed alone could strip a man faster. Murmurs broke across the hall like wind over dry leaves. Adrian stepped toward me, his voice low and lethal. Celeste, stop this. We can discuss it after. I held his gaze.
No, Adrian.
Discussion ended when you used client retention to buy a bracelet for a woman who reports to you. The third slide showed the signature chain. Adrian's approval, Ivy's acknowledgement. A consulting agreement routed through Harbor Vantage, a shell company owned by her mother's brother. 2 travel bookings filed as site review. 3. Jewelry purchases split across cultural hosting and design research. 12 cash equivalent transfers labeled temporary retention bonuses. Each had a date. Each had a document trail. Each connected back to one of the folders I had spent months building. People later asked whether I had enjoyed the look on Ivy's face when she realized her ambition had left fingerprints everywhere. Enjoyed was not the word. I observed it the way a surgeon observes infection after an incision. Carefully, without sentiment. She had gone white around the mouth. One hand clenched the edge of the table so hard her knuckles shone. The other rose halfway, maybe toward Adrian, maybe toward her throat. Her pupils were huge. She looked suddenly very young, which was unfortunate for her and deeply common in women who confuse proximity to power with possession of it. Board counsel came on stage next. He announced what the guests could already feel. Adrian Vale was being placed on immediate administrative leave pending full review, with his signing authority revoked, his access suspended, and his proposed reorganization of North Quay nullified. The interim chief operating officer, Martin Esser, was summoned from the front row in visible shock to assume transitional control. Then the council turned toward Ivy.
Lynn, he said evenly, you are also suspended pending inquiry into related party transactions, procurement influence, and inducements received from a superior officer.
A security manager appeared at the aisle. Another approached the side stairs. The sight of corporate security on the stage of a philanthropic gala had an absurdity to it, but absurdity often improves the flavor of justice. Adrian finally abandoned composure. He reached for my elbow hard enough to bruise. This is insanity, he hissed. You are humiliating yourself. I removed his hand finger by finger. No, Adrian, I said. I'm returning the humiliation to sender. I had saved the intimate evidence for the final cut, not because I needed it to win the room, but because I wanted the right witnesses. When the screen changed again, it did not display bodies in bed or any cheap pornography of betrayal. It showed pattern. Adrian fastening a diamond band onto Ivy's hand in a jewelry boutique under a consultant booking. Adrian entering the Marlowe Hotel with Ivy on the night he told me he was in Zurich with investors. Adrian on the Saint Moritz balcony from the photograph she had sent me that morning. Then, finally, the still frame extracted from the theater corridor camera, 3 months earlier, his mouth on hers, his hand spread over the small of her back, seconds after he had called to say he would miss my mother's memorial dinner because a donor's plane was delayed. The hall did gasp then, not because adultery was new, because audacity was, because once a room learns it has been used as scenery for deceit, everyone inside feels insulted, and insult is more contagious than pity. I ended with one sentence. As of tonight, I have instructed my attorneys to pursue civil recovery of every asset improperly diverted during my marriage, and to initiate divorce proceedings under Clause 9 of the Vale-Rowan postnuptial agreement. Any individual who accepted, facilitated, or concealed these transfers will be named accordingly. Thank you all for supporting Rowan Heritage. We will continue cleaner than before. Then I stepped away from the microphone. I did not look back at Adrian. I did not look at Ivy. I walked down the side stairs while a storm of whispers detonated behind me. That was the moment many later romanticized as cold, queenly legendary. In truth, I remember only the weight of my earrings and the strange clarity of my own breathing. Revenge, when properly prepared, is not fire. It is geometry. The hall unraveled beautifully. Some donors left at once, unwilling to be photographed near scandal. Others stayed out of fascination. One councilman who had been negotiating permits with Adrian nearly tripped over a chair trying to avoid cameras. Ivy attempted to stand and found that her knees were not cooperating. She sat again, then rose, then sat, like a marionette whose strings had been cut one by one. Adrian tried to follow me into the backstage corridor, but security and board counsel intercepted him. I heard his voice twice, loud enough to carry through the cinderblock hall. "Celeste, you are destroying everything." On his second attempt, the voice cracked. Not with remorse, but with disbelief. Men like Adrian do not truly imagine consequences. They imagine negotiations. They assume the world will always pause long enough to hear their reasons. I had no interest in his reasons. I left by the loading dock, got into the car Marcus had arranged, and drove straight to the apartment I kept in the city for exactly this kind of night, one with clean sheets, no shared photographs, and no one who expected me to explain the mathematics of my choices. At midnight, the first call came from Adrian. I watched it light the screen and let it die. He called again from another number, then another. Then came the messages, first furious, then strategic, then pleading in a progression so predictable it would have bored me if it had not once broken my heart. "You blindsided me. This could have been handled privately. Ivy meant nothing. I was under pressure. We can fix this. Talk to me. Don't do anything irreversible. Then, please." Then Celeste answer. Then finally, "I love you." That last one almost made me laugh. Men discover love with astonishing speed when access is threatened. I forwarded every message to Marcus, turned the phone face down, and poured myself a glass of water instead of wine. I wanted a clear mind for morning. Morning brought the newspapers. The tabloids led with a still from the Gala stage and adjectives like humiliating, explosive, and heiress wrath. The financial press was more efficient. Rowan Group suspends CEO amid governance probe. Heritage spin-off halted. Board reviews related party payments. The society pages did what society pages do best, pretending concern while arranging the silverware of ruin. I called my mother before the first anchors had finished speculating. She answered on the second ring and asked only one question. "Are you safe?" When I said yes, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather would have preferred you spared him the pearl clutching, but he would have admired the timing. Eat breakfast." After that, the family machinery activated. Public relations prepared a neutral statement. Investor relations scheduled calls. Our external auditor arrived at headquarters by 10. By noon, Adrian's key cards were dead, his company email locked, and the North Quay data room under legal hold. For 7 years, I had maintained a marriage. In less than 16 hours, I restored a corporation. Ivy's parents called before Adrian's did. Her father was a deputy headmaster in Suzhou, with a voice trained by decades of speaking to other people's children, as if disappointment were a form of civic duty. He addressed me as Mrs. Vale and apologized with such careful formality that I could hear the panic underneath each polished syllable. "My daughter has made a grave mistake," he said. "She is young. She was misled. If there is any room for private resolution, our family would be deeply grateful. I stood at the kitchen counter slicing an orange and considered the phrase misled. Youth is a convenient costume for greed.
So is romance.
Mr. Lynn, I said, your daughter was old enough to demand stock options, expensive enough to accept diamonds, and bold enough to send me photographs meant to humiliate me. Tell her from me that private resolution ended the moment she decided public triumph was more important than private decency. He tried once more, invoking reputation, a mother's health, the difficulty of starting over for a woman with scandal attached to her name. That last part nearly impressed me with its honesty. Reputation matters terribly to people who never imagine it is their own that will be put on trial. Adrian's mother called an hour later from the house in Bristol, where she had spent 7 years treating me as a highly efficient foreign appliance. She had always preferred the version of me that hosted Christmas elegantly and kept Adrian fed while asking for little. Now her voice shook with rage, so uncontrolled she forgot to disguise it as civility.
What have you done to my son? She demanded.
Men are weak. Women should be wise enough not to ruin a family over a weakness. Ivy is trash, obviously, but trash only enters a home when the wife stops paying attention. I let her speak. There is no point interrupting a woman who has confused male irresponsibility with male nature. Eventually, she announces the architecture of her own misery. When she finished, I said, very softly, Adrian diverted company funds and breached a binding postnuptial clause. If prison worries you, perhaps redirect some of that maternal energy toward the son who signed false expense forms with his own hand. Then I hung up. My pulse remained perfectly steady. I think that was the moment I understood the affair had finally died in me. Not when I saw the photograph, not even at the gala, but when the old accusations struck and found no wound left open. The internal audit moved faster than even Marcus expected, because misconduct loves company. Once the first discrepancy was exposed, employees who had swallowed Adrian's arrogance for years began remembering details. A procurement manager submitted emails showing he had overridden vendor bids at Ivy's request. An assistant in finance produced a log of reimbursement patterns that clustered around weekends and foreign trips with no client attendance. One designer, furious that Ivy had once taken credit for her campaign concepts, forwarded voice notes in which Ivy bragged that the old queen would soon be out of the way and that Adrian was too dazzled by her to notice how much she was charging through friends. That line spread through the office like kerosene finding sparks. People imagine organizations collapse from one scandal. Usually they collapse from all the smaller humiliations the scandal finally licenses people to discuss. 3 days later, Marcus took me through the divorce petition. It was devastatingly simple. Infidelity, reputational harm, misuse of shared property, and grounds for immediate separation under our agreement. Because I had entered the marriage with more assets, and because Adrian's gifted units were tied to conduct clauses, he was in a weaker position than he understood. He still had his salary, his apartment in his own name, and the illusion that charm could produce compromise. What he did not have was leverage. I asked Marcus to prepare one additional motion concerning the apartment we had shared in Knightsbridge. I had purchased it before our marriage through a family vehicle. Adrian had spent years calling it our place as if language could amend title. I wanted immediate exclusive possession, all keys surrendered, inventory of removed items, and a forensic check of art and jewelry. The law, when properly organized, can be one of the most satisfying forms of literature. Every paragraph closes a door. Adrian finally reached me through Martin Esser, who called not as interim chief, but as a man who had once watched me rescue a quarter's budget while Adrian flirted through a donor dinner. He said Adrian wished to meet in person and discuss terms before things became uglier. I agreed for one reason only. I wanted to hear what story he would choose now that all the others had failed. We met in a private room at the Larch House, a hotel my family owned before Adrian was born. He looked worse than the papers suggested. The suit was expensive, the face was not sleeping, and there was a slight tremor in his fingers when he reached for the water. Celeste, he began, this has gone too far. Too far, I asked. You mean farther than lying for months? Farther than spending company money on your mistress? Farther than planning to announce her into a new division built on my trust property while I sat in the room and applauded? He flinched once, then regrouped into what had once been a very effective expression, intelligent, wounded sincerity. Ivy was a mistake. A symptom, maybe? I was lonely. You were always working. You stopped seeing me. There, it was the oldest translation in the book. I betrayed you because your competence distracted me. I had expected something more inventive. Instead, I got hunger in a better suit, Adrian spoke of being admired by me rather than loved by me, of feeling assessed instead of understood, of my habit of solving instead of soothing. He said Ivy had made him feel spontaneous, brilliant, young. He said she had looked at him as if he were the center of a story. He said my silences had become unbearable. I listened all the way through because nothing humiliates a man quite like being allowed the full space to reveal the poverty of his motives. When he finished, I asked, did spontaneity require falsifying expense codes? Did youth require shell vendors? Did being adored require using my family's legacy to fund your vanity? He looked away. After a long pause, he said, more quietly, I never meant to lose you. That was true. Adrian never planned for loss. He planned for expansion. He wanted wife, mistress, title, admiration, future. He simply discovered, too late, that some structures fail when overloaded. I slid the divorce papers across the table. Sign, and we keep the criminal side focused on the company claims already in motion. Refuse, and I stop making any distinction between private harm and public remedy. He did not sign that day. Pride kept him upright for another 48 hours. In those hours, he made 2 errors. The first was trying to contact Ivy repeatedly on channels already under review. The second was assuming she would stay loyal once the lights changed. Ivy called me from an unlisted number late on the second night. Her voice was shredded with crying, yet vanity still coded every plea. He lied to me, she said. He told me your marriage was dead and everything but paperwork. He told me North Quay would be ours to build. He told me you only cared about control, that you had other men, that you would be relieved when he left. I sat in the dark listening to the woman who had once sent me beach photographs, now discovering that men who lie to wives are strangely willing to lie to mistresses. She begged me to meet. I said no. Then, because I am not immune to precision, I added, if he promised you a kingdom built on documents he did not own, perhaps your real problem is not him, but the price at which you sold your judgment. She came anyway. Security at Knightsbridge informed me the next afternoon that a woman in cream wool was in the lobby asking to speak to Mrs. Vale before it was too late. I went down because I wanted to see what ambition looks like once the applause stops. Ivy stood by the orchids holding a leather folder and trying badly to look composed. Up close, she seemed almost translucent, the sort of beauty that relies on momentum, and therefore suffers terribly when made to stand still. She extended the folder to me. These are copies of some of Adrian's messages, she said. He had me approve travel on his instructions. He used my family accounts for some routing, but he knew. He knew everything. If I cooperate, can you keep me from being named in the recovery action? I took the folder but did not open it.
You are already named, I said.
Her mouth parted in disbelief. I was never cruel for sport, but there are moments when mercy becomes another form of disrespect. You wanted visibility, Ivy? Consider this the purest kind. Her eyes flooded then, not with guilt, but with panic. She whispered, I loved him. I looked at her for a long moment.
No, I said.
You loved the version of yourself you thought he could certify. The lawsuit named her anyway. Marcus said the evidentiary value of her materials was useful, but not useful enough to excuse receipt of stolen benefits, influence over contracts, and participation in concealment. Adrian heard about the lobby meeting within an hour. His next message did not claim love or misunderstanding. It contained only 4 words. You met with her, I did not answer. By then, the board had already voted to terminate him for cause, reclaim a portion of his performance units, and formally refer the procurement matter to the regulators. The market reacted with temporary nerves, then relief once Martin and I presented a stabilizing plan. Investors, contrary to fantasy, do not hate scandal nearly as much as they hate incompetence. Remove the second, and the first becomes survivable. I gave interviews that week not about betrayal, but about governance, stewardship, and the need for transparent leadership in family-backed institutions. It was strangely soothing to speak in the language I had always trusted most.
Numbers.
Controls.
Timelines.
Accountability. The heart, once broken, often prefers structure to poetry. My mother wanted me to leave London society for a while and come to Florence with her. I almost agreed. Then I walked through the North Quay site in a hard hat at dawn. The river air bitter and metallic steel bones rising out of mud, and felt something stronger than exhaustion. I felt ownership, not the legal kind, which had never been in question, but the internal kind, the bodily conviction that I had spent too many years shrinking in rooms I built. Adrian had made many mistakes. One of them was educational. In trying to move Ivy into my line of sight, he forced me to step back into my own. That realization hardened into a new plan. I would not just preserve North Quay. I would take over the whole development group directly. No more shadows. No more husbands explaining my own work back to me at dinner parties. If I was to be publicly wounded, I would at least use the blood as ink. The divorce hearing lasted less than an hour because Adrian's lawyers, having read the room and the evidence, urged settlement terms rather than theater. He arrived looking 10 years older than when I had last loved him. When the clerk asked whether he understood the agreement, he said yes without meeting my eyes. He would receive one apartment purchased solely in his own name before our marriage, a reduced package of retained personal effects, and nothing from Rowan-controlled trusts or properties. He would repay the documented portion of misused shared funds through liquidated investments and future earnings, subject to civil judgment. He would not speak publicly about me, my family, or internal company matters. He would not contest the moral cause provisions already triggered. Outside the courthouse, he finally looked at me directly and said, "You really could have destroyed me." I adjusted my gloves. "Adrian," I replied, "this is me choosing efficiency. Destruction takes longer." Then I stepped into the car and left him under the stone lions, a man discovering what his own reflection looked like without borrowed gold around it. Ivy did not attend the hearing. Marcus later told me her counsel was trying to negotiate personal repayment schedules and avoid litigation over the Harbor Vantage transfers. Her world had narrowed with shocking speed. The lifestyle magazines that once courted her for features on new creative women went silent. A cosmetics brand quietly withdrew a campaign dinner invitation after seeing her name in the filings. 2 married investors she had kept circling her on social media suddenly stopped commenting. Even the women who once envied her had little patience for a mistress who failed to secure the throne she had climbed toward. I took no pleasure in imagining her reduced circumstances. Pleasure suggests appetite. What I felt was completion. A debt had been measured and assigned. Whether she paid it in money, shame, or diminished options was no longer a matter of emotional interest. The trap was never designed to entertain me. It was designed to rebalance a ledger. Months passed. North Quay resumed under tighter controls and unexpectedly better morale. Martin was efficient enough to keep trains running, but it was clear to everyone that strategic decisions were now coming through me. I chaired design reviews, renegotiated 2 brutal contractor packages, replaced half the procurement committee, and personally led the investor presentation in Singapore that locked in our next financing tranche. For years, reporters had described me as elegant, low profile, intensely private. Within 6 months, they had to find new adjectives: exacting, decisive, unsparing. The male commentators tried, of course, to turn pain into my origin story, as if competence required betrayal to become visible, as if I had not been this woman all along. I stopped reading them. The women in my office did not need another narrative about being remade by men. They needed proof that a woman could remain entirely herself and simply stop apologizing for the scale of her reach. One autumn evening, nearly a year after the gala, I attended a fundraising dinner at the museum annex overlooking the river. North Quay's first residential tower had begun pre-sales, and the museum's education wing was ahead of schedule. After my remarks, a journalist in a blue suit caught me near the staircase and asked the question everyone eventually asked: "Do you believe in second chances?" She said, recorder half hidden in her palm. I looked past her toward the river lights, toward cranes moving with patient purpose in the dark. "I believe in consequences," I said. "Some people grow because they face them. Some people collapse because they think consequences are cruelty. The difference is character, not opportunity." She asked if that meant I would never remarry. I almost smiled. That is not what I said. Love may return. Delusion will not. The line ran the next morning in 3 papers and on half the business feeds by lunch. Adrian wrote only once after the divorce. It was not a plea, not an excuse, and therefore more unsettling than either. He said he had taken a teaching fellowship in Lisbon. Temporary, nothing grand. He said he had finally understood that admiration without discipline rots into entitlement. He said the silence after scandal was teaching him what applause had hidden. At the end, he added one sentence: "I wish I had learned all this without paying with you." I read it twice, then archived it. There was no triumph in his diminished tone, only distance. We had become each other's completed lessons. That was enough. As for Ivy, the last I heard, she had left London for Dubai under a different job title, still orbiting men richer and older than herself, still mistaking access for elevation. Perhaps she would keep climbing. Perhaps she would fall again. Ambition is not a flaw. But ambition without self-respect eventually bills itself at compound interest. 2 years after the night, she sent me the St. Moritz photograph. North Quay opened its waterfront museum with a winter exhibition on reclaimed cities. I stood in the restored atrium while guests moved under a ceiling of suspended glass birds, each one lit from within. The mayor gave a speech. Donors clapped. The press crowded near the installations. Someone from the Architecture Council said the project had become a symbol of disciplined reinvention. I accepted the compliment because it belonged not just to me but to every woman on my team who had been called difficult when she was simply precise. Later, after the crowds thinned, I walked alone to the top floor terrace. The river below was black silk cut by white wakes. Somewhere behind me, music drifted up from the gala dinner, starting in the main hall. I held the railing and thought of the woman I had been the night Adrian first kissed me under fireworks in my parents' garden. She had been earnest, dazzled, hungry to be chosen by brilliance. I did not despise her. She had loved honestly. What mattered was that when honesty was answered with contempt, she did not stay small forever. At some point during the evening, my assistant found me on the terrace with 2 urgent folders and 1 absurd smile.
There is something you should see, she said.
The private members club waitstaff had reported a guest insisting he knew you personally and had the right to send over a bottle. I glanced at the card she handed me. It was from a venture partner named Elias Marr, sharp, dry, irritatingly observant, and someone who had spent the past 6 months disagreeing with me in meetings just enough to make them interesting. The note read, "To the woman who proved that public architecture is less impressive than private nerve. If you are tired of being congratulated, come argue with me about waterfront zoning." I laughed before I could stop myself. My assistant, delighted by rare evidence that I had a pulse outside spreadsheets, asked whether she should send him away.
Not yet, I said.
Let him wait 10 minutes. Then I returned to the river once more, not because I needed closure, but because I wanted to stand for one more breath in the clean air of a life I had taken back with both hands. People later said I had arranged the whole downfall with impossible coldness, as if women become less human when they refuse to die of humiliation. That was never true. I had been hurt. I had lost sleep. I had sat on bathroom floors at 3 a.m, feeling my own dignity like a cracked tooth I could not stop touching. I had remembered every year of trying, every compromise, every careful kindness offered into a marriage that consumed them without gratitude. But pain is not a command. It does not get to decide what you worship next. I chose not to worship betrayal. I chose not to turn adultery into the defining weather of my life. Instead, I treated it like contamination. Identify the source, contain the spread, sterilize the instruments, and rebuild the room. Perhaps that is why women like Ivy and men like Adrian feared me more once I went quiet. Noise they understood. Noise reassured them. Noise meant they still occupied the center. Silence backed by preparation meant the center had moved. So if anyone asks how a rich woman made a mistress pay for ambition, the answer is embarrassingly simple. I did not scream. I did not beg. I did not pull hair under chandeliers or collapse into martyr's poetry. I read contracts. I tracked numbers. I remembered who had legal title and who merely had access. I let greed sign its own name, often enough that denial became impossible. And when the stage was full and the lights were bright, I let 2 people who believed they were ascending discover that the floor beneath them had never been theirs. The rest was gravity. Ambition is only beautiful when it can bear its own reflection. When it feeds on theft, vanity, and borrowed power, it eventually invoices the wrong woman. I was not the wrong woman. I was the bill collector.